to the Organic Filaments Network. Today we're joined by Dr. Darshana Sreedhar Mini, author of Rated A, Soft Porn Cinema, and the Mediations of Desire in India, and co-editor of the Porn Studies Special Issue, South Asian Pornographies, Vernacular Formations of the Permissible and the Obscene. We're going to discuss censorship, caste, film, labor, and the politics of sexuality in South Asia. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. How are you doing, Krishna?
I'm doing good, Cher. It's great to have this chat with you, and I'm so looking forward to your questions.
Yeah, I'm really excited too. Your work deals with subjects that are often seen as taboo. How has the response been?
It's interesting. This project actually started in 2010 when I decided to do a pilot study in Kodambakkam. So at that point of time, it was just like trying to find who were the people who were making these films because no one knows anything about the filmmakers because they were anonymous. They used fictitious names. From 2010, doing the pilot to 2024, when the book came out, it's been more than 14 years. So the project changed a lot. And, in terms of the stakes I have in intervening in labor studies, understanding precarious labor practices, and also understanding what embodied labor means for many of these actresses, it took me into a rabbit hole, I should say, because you start a project, you are trying to understand what this project would mean for South Asian cinema, but then you understand it's not just about South Asian cinema, it's about media flows, it's about understanding the way in which region is connected to transnational. So I think it has been like a really good journey so far. The book has been received very differently among different quarters. I think, like it has been reviewed by popular press. And like you said, I think people were interested in understanding why an academic would be interested in doing, work, 15 plus years of work on a taboo topic. And some others were like also asking about the kind of pressures, challenges that I faced, and, which was kind of substantial as well, I should say, as a female ethnographer working on adult media in a conservative society as an insider. I should say that because insider outsider dichotomy also creates this idea of who gets access and like what are the conditions of possibility under which works could be done. We can get into it in our conversation, but um
Yeah.
and again, like some from conservative quarters, there was pushback as well. Men's rights group were like up in arms, and some of the
Oh,
some of
wow.
was Zoom bombed by men's rights group who wanted to reclaim their voice and agency, which they thought they lost through my work because it's about female sexual pleasure. So it's interesting that in this current political climate, it becomes much more balanced to talk about what does it mean to do feminist work in South Asia.
Yeah. Yeah. So your book opens up with a deep personal reflection on growing up in Kerala. And Kerala is such a beautiful place, but you also describe it as a place with sort of progressive social indicators, high literacy, leftist politics, but also deeply entrenched in gendered norms, right? Gendered and casteist norms. How did this contradiction shape your understanding of sexuality in media?
The myth around the Kerala model development has been something that fascinated me when I started researching on how gender and sexuality and norms kind of mediate a certain expectation of ideal femininity. And there has been like brilliant scholarship based on Kerala by scholars like J. Devika, Navanita Mukil, G. Arunima, and others, looking at the way in which the matrilineal past of some of the communities also creates certain expectations on what does it mean to have this progressive liberatory space where the social indices are all really high. And you would expect that, with literacy, high rates of literacy, women have equal stakes in the way in which, conversations take shape in public sphere, which unfortunately was not the case. I think the root realization for any scholar working in Kerala is that, the contradiction is where, you are able to understand the nuances around like gender, caste, class, and different matrices of intersectionality, which creates new ways in which different groups can enter and exit, and not on equal terms at all, like whose voices get heard, and how are these people pitched in the kind of rational deliberative public sphere. That was something which really really interested me, because the idea of media publics that I'm pitching in the book emerged from that, the kind of contradictoriness, the messiness. And I wanted to understand the kind of problematics within which women, and also like empowered women, both sexually, and who wanted to create their own kind of autonomous space, or women who are career oriented. They wanted to really think about upward social mobility in a different terms. How are these women being portrayed in public space, and the kind of expectations that are put upon them. So caste becomes like a very important vector. I still remember that when I was growing up, this was late 90s, early 2000s. I still remember that there was this suicide by a Dalit scholar. I think, she was a college student and she couldn't pay the fee and she was kind of bullied and she committed suicide. And the media reports on that suicide was very strange. I still remember that, some of the reports were also speculating on the kind of like sandals she were wearing and saying that how did she get money to buy the sandals. So it became like pinned down on speculating, creating this idea of gossip and rumor and fragmentary information circulated, creating kind of thicket of information, so much information so that you can spin stories around it which might have nothing to do with the factual claims. So this kind of constant attack on women coming from caste oppressed communities, and for that matter, like how women in general are attacked in public, it created a certain kind of normalcy around what does it mean to appear as an idealized Malayali woman who will be embraced by the society as like someone who could be accommodated into the bourgeois middle class family norms. So my work has been to rethink what is family, what does it mean to create certain cultural expectations around this is how you would fit in within the heteronormative matrix.
Yeah.
Softporn films were fascinating for me on two counts. One was because it was all about heterosexual man's fascination for certain bodies, certain women, certain desires. But again, these films also had like a kind of an unsettling quality. They were all centered around strong female characters, whom in the book I called Madhaka Rani, who were all driven by this desire to bypass the class caste constraints and go for upward social mobility. They might have used their body as like a vehicle, as a weapon for this social mobility. But I was fascinated by the desire for them to create and chart out a way where they are negotiating with patriarchy for upward social mobility. So I don't call Madhaka Rani as a feminist figure. I would say that Madhaka Rani uses the patriarchal logic by understanding that you will negotiate with patriarchy because you cannot completely get away from patriarchy. It's so enwrapped in the way we think, the way institutional structures are formulated, that a woman who is outside the idea of a kind of a heterosexual family model will be the one who will be able to understand how to unsettle the idealized understanding of femininity. So that woman became important for me. And from my conversation with many queer, community members, they all said that they were fascinated by this figure of Madhaka Rani, not because of the heterosexual kind of underpinnings of the desire that many men were fascinated by, but they thought that by being the bad woman, she can actually go to the extreme of badness, right? Like you don't have to be an ideal woman anymore. So you're anyway being cast aside as someone who did not fit into the familial norms of heterosexual, middle class norms. And so that gave that woman the power to actually recast and rethink what it means to actually exist in this society with this contradictory social norms in place.
Yeah, absolutely. Like in your field work, you conducted interviews with technicians, body doubles, and distributors and actresses. What were some of the biggest challenges in researching a subject that carries such stigma?
So when I started this project, the only work that was available, like looking soft porn in a academic kind of way, like as a research intervention, was Pradesh Radhakrishnan's 2010 work, Soft Porn, Anxieties and Family. And that was a trigger for me to understand what else can we know about a form which is basically written about in a very sensational way as exploitative practice, as something that is kind of promoting a certain kind of casting couch. So there is only like stories which were looking at soft porn industry as a hub of vice that I could locate. But I actually thought that there is a labor involved. There are people making these films. We might not know them. And sometimes journalists might not have access, and like whatever knowledge you might know of the industry is also mediated via different sources. So I wanted to actually understand who were behind the making of the film. So I went to Kodambakkam and stayed there for a long time. So the idea of cinematic wait time I write in chapter 3 is also part of the waiting for people to speak. Because unlike a project where you have a data set you work with or you know exactly whom to speak, for a project like this, it's also the willingness of the people to get back in touch with you once they know you are looking for them. That was important for me. And I think the question of ethics is so important, especially when you are doing a project which is about other people's failure, other people's misery, the way in which they were cast aside, how their careers were destroyed. So I think I was very cognizant of the fact that this is not like any other project where you can finish your PhD and move on. It's a project where you are trying to figure out alongside your respondents what happened, what could have happened differently. So I think that kind of connection was something I was consistently trying to build. And a lot of people, and especially like in an industry which is informal, it takes a lot of time for people to trust you. So I also had to like work in the industry, like take odd jobs, once as a dubbing artist, then as a production assistant. So they all knew that I was there not to get the data and move on, but also like trying to understand how the industry worked. And I think that experience really, really helped me, because it's first of all, it's a very humbling experience to also know that it's not about armchair intellectualism where you sit there and write, but it's also to understand the contingencies, the kind of anxieties, insecurities, vulnerabilities the respondents went through. And as a researcher, I am going through, because there was a point of time when, I was waiting in Kodambakkam and nothing really happened other than me going to the film labs, waiting with, people who were waiting for jobs, whom I, in my book, refer to as film hopefuls, who come from different, acting schools. So it was a very interesting experience to see how this unpacks. So in the book, I actually talk about different scales of labor practices. That sometimes when you talk about film labor or cinema laborer or cinema worker, we are not just talking about above the line, below the line distinction. Even though these phrases are emerging from the global north context, we need to understand that there are different scales of practices. Above the line would involve creative decision making, where you have director, cinematographer, the main cast. All of them are paid outright, like the amount they negotiate with the producer, as opposed to the below the line labor, some of whom have to be paid daily wages. Some others, it's also about like, a contract, but again, they will be paid at the end of the shift. So it's interesting to understand what does it mean to procure labor. And I call this practice, which is prevalent in many industries at the time, as proximate networks, where everyone feels that they have to be closer to people who have power and creative making, basically socialize in the same circle and, be part of their team so that you are able to procure work. And so that kind of expectations is also creating this kind of clique mentality where, most of the men kind of, expect that production manager, production executive is the person, the go-to person, and to who will be able to give work, but who will also be able to connect you to other set of people who are, wielding more power. So power is out there in the way jobs are given, promises and assurance are given. And for me, it was important to understand what makes people move to a place like Kodambakkam, or for that matter, Bombay, wait for this hope that something will turn up at some point of time. So when I spoke with many of my respondents, there was this person who was running a tea shop, who came in the 19s to be a actor. That didn't work out, and he ended up be running a tea shop, first as an assistant to a tea vendor, and then he started one of his own after like 7 or 8 years. So it's interesting that people kind of migrate to different occupations, primarily because everyone is trying to do the idea of make do arrangements to survive. And that became one of the ways I was looking at soft porn. Soft porn not as an industry which is morally corrupt, because that's easy to make an argument. It's morally corrupt, there is sex, and you move on. But what else is happening there was something that really, really, fascinated me when I started to have conversations with people. And that's where, speaking with people, and, many of these people were also like very generous with sharing the material. So for a project like this, you cannot go to state institutions like National Film Archive of India to look at the prints, because these are not even legitimate material of study for state institutions. So I relied on for this project are material from personal collectors, scrap dealers, and some of the film personnel who used to collect materials of the films that they participated in. So I think it's like my project was also trying to move out of pure methodology of doing film studies by trying to do what I call impure methods. I'm happy to talk more about it, but it was important for me to say why I did what I did. And impure method became one way of understanding why qualitative research methodologies could work with archival research and ethnographic research and participant observation in order to triangulate the data, especially because nothing else has been written on soft porn. So when you become the first person to basically do an industry study of a form that has been seen as of degraded aesthetics and not of like important in terms of form and content, there is an additional responsibility invested in you, and that's where the ethics of the researcher becomes important.
Yeah, and I think I'm just gonna transition into just return back to the Madhaka Rani sort of figure. And you write, the figure of the Madhaka Rani, the hyper visible siren, became a symbol of transgressive desire, but also of caste coded anxieties about female sexuality. And Dalit feminist scholars argue that desire in South Asia is structured by caste. Did you see this play out in your own research?
Yeah,
On
totally. Yeah, I think, that's an important kind of distinction one need to make between what becomes desirable and how is, the idea of consumption of certain bodies and certain desires and fantasies centered around the intersectional identities of, caste and class. And especially women who come from caste oppressed background, their bodies were seen as accessible or visible, hyper visible, so much so that their agency, their desires, or who they are completely in the background. Shailaja Paik has looked fantastic work where she's actually looking at this idea of respectability, right? Like when you are writing about lower caste women and desire, and she's talking in the context of tamasha, and she talks about this idea of like dignity. How do you talk about dignity even when you are, performing a kind of a cultural performance like tamasha? And that's where, the question of respectability came over and over again, because I do not want it to see like the figure of Madhaka Rani is devoid of caste or class, or the idea of like what kind of bodies are allowed to circulate very freely in this kind of a informal film circuit. So many of these women who came to Kodambakkam in the 1980s came from caste oppressed communities, but there were also women who came from upper caste background, not necessarily upper class, who were all like driven by they wanted to become actresses, and they left their families. Many of them eloped with their people. Like some of them came together, like in 2, 3 women from a village decided to come to Kodambakkam, wanting to explore what does it mean to basically, seek out for work and employment. So there is this idea of cinephilia sometimes that we do not think of when we speak about actresses or
yeah,
actors wanting to, come to this place, a hub of dreams, whether it's like Hollywood or for that matter, Bollywood or Kodambakkam. So for me, it was important to like first make this distinction that the caste cannot be a question that is like added at a later point of time. Caste is always already there, but we do not see it. And the
yeah.
example that I've used in the book is Silk Smitha. Like Silk Smitha, her death, the way in which the sensational reportage around it, some of which is not in the book, but it's going to come out as a separate piece because not everything could go there.
Yeah.
But Silk
Can you
Smitha's,
explain, give a brief context of who this figure is and why she's important to your work?
yeah, thank you, Cher. So, in the first chapter, when I'm describing Madhaka Rani and using Madhaka Rani as an analytical category, I am using the case study of 3 actresses, Silk Smitha, Rani Padmini, and Vijayashree. All of them had like their deaths and obituaries written about by film journalists. So, Rani Padmini and her mother were murdered. Vijayashree committed suicide, and it was also seen as a murder because by the time she committed suicide or by the time of her death, she was having like a huge legal battle with one of the prominent studios, Udaya Studio, at that point of time. And
Hmm.
which was all centered around kind of a wardrobe malfunction that was caught during the film shoot, which she didn't know of, but which she knew at later point of time was included in the film or circulated informally. So she basically started to question the studio, telling that you should have asked my permission. And then the studio kind of like said that you have always been cast in these roles, you never had any issues about it. And it became like this kind of tug of war between a woman wanting to reclaim her image, saying that, I have acted in these roles doesn't mean that I'm okay with these things. So the idea of consent and all of this became very, very interesting ideas to think about, like what becomes Malayalam film industry's kind of questions around gender safety, which comes in 2024 when Hema Commission report, the Judicial Committee constituted by the government to look at how gender operates and how safety norms are instituted.
Interesting.
So for me, it was important for multiple reasons. So Rani Padmini, who was murdered by, and her mother, who was murdered by the driver, Vijayashree, and finally Silk Smitha. And Silk Smitha was a dancer who essentially started as an assistant to a makeup artist, and then she became a dancer, and she was very prominent dancer actress. So what happened? So this is like a precursor to the item numbers that Bollywood will kind of insert the later point of time. And she was a dancer, and there are sequences of cabaret where Silk Smitha appears in a lot of films in South Indian languages, as well as like films dubbed in Hindi and Sinhala. So her dance numbers were seen as an integral part of the box office success of any film at that point of time. So 1980 to 86 was the time where her films were like, succeeding one after the other. So Silk Smitha wanted to try production, and it didn't work out. There were other kind of issues that she was battling, and she committed suicide. So in all these three instances, the film journalistic discourse was around looking at the bodies of the corpses of each of these actresses as kind of with a forensic gaze. So all the obituary columns that you will see in film magazines were interested in the number of cuts in the body and the way in which the body was placed in the room, dimension of the room, what else was there. Rani Padmini and her mother's body was found after 5 to 6 days. By then it started disintegrating, and it was folded on a palm mat. So even the photo of a palm mat appeared in the film journals kind of coverage of news photographs. So there is something happening there which probably you will not see in the death reports of prominent actresses who are mainstream actors or actresses. And that's why it really struck me that there is something more happening, because their personal lives are right now opened and exposed for anyone to intervene in. And the kind of discretion that possibly might have been there in terms of rumors and gossips are all laid to rest when it comes to women who are cast as Madhaka Rani. It's as if they are being made as equivalent to sex workers, and that's the kind of rhetoric that has been in the film industry over a period of time, that actresses have to constantly protect themselves and their image. And it was even insisted that they should have like a male guardian who will be shepherding them, so that this idea of them being available sexually is not kind of allowed. So more women from middle class, upper caste backgrounds started to enter film industry. There was also certain respectability expected out of these women, and how that respectability will also, tie with the respectability film industry was demanding as a legitimate form of business.
Yeah, I think that it relates back to the fact that caste-based sexual violence in India, from even the colonial period, right, to cases like Hathras, Unnao,
right,
reveal how caste and desire intersect in violent ways, right? And do you think mainstream discussions about gender often erase caste from those conversations? Or, what is your perspective on that?
Yeah, so let me just go back to the example, because that will be like a good example to showcase how mainstream film industry erases caste. Silk Smitha died, and then there was a film called Dirty Picture, which was made in 2011. By Millie Vitria. So the film was seen as a biopic of Silk Smitha. That's how it was publicized. It was released on December 2nd, till Silk Smitha's family filed a defamation suit, saying that, this is like sensational kind of news reports which doesn't have any factual claims, and you're interested in gossip. You've never done any research, right? Like for any film on a biopic, you really need to do research on the subject. And here the subject is dead. Here the subject is also seen as a dancer and seen as acting in sexualized roles. So they took liberty with it. And then, I remember that there was this kind of war of words between Silk Smitha's family and the director, and also the Vinu Chakravarti, who was the director who made the first film with Silk Smitha, called Vandi Chakram, where she acted in the role of a sex worker. And he was the one who gave the name Smitha to her. Her real name is Vijay Lakshmi. He and Ekta Kapoor, the producer of Dirty Picture, they also had like this kind of a very aggressive kind of conversation saying that you never did the research. And then Ikta Kapoor responding to, Chakravarti saying that Silk Smitha is not yours. Silk Smitha is everyone. So ultimately what the film became, and if you see the film, you will know that the film ends with a shot of Vidya Balan, who enacts the role of Silk Smitha in her deathbed in that, saffron mark and red color sari and all of that, which Silk Smitha was never. Silk Smitha was very curt in her responses. She was one of those figures who, right from early on, understood that there were different hierarchies among actresses. Even when she was invited, to have food with others, she understood that she was not considered as an actress. She was only considered as a dancer. So those kind of conversations also meant that the film journalistic reports had never anything good to say about her because they were not interested in Silk Smitha or what she was trying to say. And Silk Smitha's caste was never discussed when she was alive.
Yeah.
So when Dirty Picture came out, I think two important things I want to say here, which is like Jenny Ravenna wrote this amazing article in Roundtable India where she spoke about how Vidya Balan, an upper caste woman, enacting a fair-skinned upper caste woman, is enacting the role of a actress whose dusky skin was seen as the mark of the sexualized role and eroticized the role she performed. And the dark skin and the lower caste status, everything comes to discussion with Dirty Picture. Till then, no conversation on caste. But Dirty Picture doesn't make this anything about caste. It doesn't refer to caste at all. It only make it like, a kind of a Bollywood, a rags to riches story of, a junior artist wanting to become a lead actress. So it completely eliminated that. And the second problem with the film was also that it created a kind of a, bogeyman in terms of like soft porn industry as contributing to the deterioration of Silk Smitha. Silk Smitha was never a soft porn actress.
Yeah.
Silk Smitha acted in films which showcased her in the cast of Madhaka Rani as a sexually autonomous woman who was deeply interested in, understanding her desires and moving out of the kind of marital conjugality, but that doesn't make her a soft porn actress. So that's where the question of caste becomes important. Whose narrative can you co-opt? And finally, it became like, co-optation by Bollywood of a regional film industry and the actress who came from there for box office success because they were not really interested in understanding the nexus of caste or class or the labor practices or anything that politically relevant that Silk Smitha put forth.
Yeah. When we speak about online porn archives in the book, like the categories on X videos that label women as rural maid or low caste girl, right? This also mirrors that sort of colonial era sexual economies. What does this tell us about the persistence of caste in the digital pornography realm as well? Like when we're thinking about the pornographic archive, and you've said that it is both a fantasy structure and a material reality of sorts.
So there are two responses to it. One is soft porn era has totally fizzled out by right? So after it fizzled out because of the oversaturation of content, the same kind of narrative and thematic kind of repetition, it led to the fizzling out of the industry. So the industry was not there anymore. But during the pandemic, there were a bunch of, OTT platforms that popped up. All of them are drawing the narrative from the soft porn films. And they were very popular in India and also in South Asia because the moment you pull one down, another one pops up. So it was kind of a concern for the government in terms of trying to regulate it and understanding what else is happening. So in the platform era, I think there are two things that is happening. Like many QR scholars have written about the very fact that sometimes people are looking for representations, looking for bodies, connections, and the kind of desires that they want. And for our community, especially in very sexually conservative societies, sometimes online platforms are the places that are connecting people. So, looking pornography right from the kind of like, it's like a zone of illicit media and making a blanket claim will completely eliminate the desire of communities who are not like, or, have like different desires, etc. But at the same time, this doesn't mean like, people are allowing child pornography either. So I think we needed to understand that pornographic practices encompass a wide array of things. In the 1990s, if you remember, that the material that was circulated around HIV/AIDS were also seen as pornography because anything to do with sex could become pornography And pornographers, the term also comes about writing about prostitutes. So there's always this idea of unconventional sexual behavior that doesn't fit into the norm or dominant paradigm that's used to refer to pornography. So I think whenever I'm using pornography or talking about media regulation, I try to mark this distinction. One is like the idea of age appropriate media. That is one of the ways in which soft porn was trying to market itself by saying that this is 18 plus. They are all adults, right? They're not films where you can go and watch it with your children. And even the Central Board of Film Certification, they also came up with videos. Films Division came up with videos on what is an A film, right? So A film is a film where you will not take your children. So I think 19 in early 2000, like 2007, there was even a proposal in the Indian Information and Broadcasting Ministry that was proposed by Vijay Anand, who was the Central Board of Film Certification chairman, that there has to be theaters where A films can be exhibited. They can be just for A films. But he had a huge pushback and had to resign. So it's interesting that what is consumed, what platforms do these forms take, are all important when we are discussing about like pornography as a discourse, pornography as a representation, pornography as a mode of practice connecting people. And there is also a wide circulation of phone sex, escort services, all of which are also making use of the similar practices. So I mean, I did field work in Middle Eastern Gulf. I also like spoke with sex workers about like what is a pornographic imagination that comes across in the way they are meeting with the clients, because in the lot of like Indians from blue collar labor force in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Saudi. So my fieldwork is mostly in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. So many of these women said that these men are not really coming to have sex. They just want company, right? Like you are staying away from your family and you're just looking for a kind of a connection, the kind of relationality that you're building in a place where you're both aliens. You're always guest workers. You will never become citizens, right? And some of these women are being asked by these men to actually read out some pornographic literature, and that was it. And so it's important to keep in mind that soft porn is not just a filmic form. It had its precedents in erotic fiction and also like illustrations. There is a longer history that soft porn is entering, and the kind of continuation of soft porn is what you refer to in terms of OTT platforms exclusively meant for soft porn and certain bodies which are seen as hyper visible and desirable. So in some dating sites, right, like saying what your racial or ethnic preferences are one way of again like tapping into a specific narrow pool of people that you're interested in. And that's the same algorithmic logic that you will see in many porn sites. So Pornhub for sorry. Good.
Yeah, I wanted to continue on sort of the hypervisibility, the theme for a bit. Shakila became a major box office draw. Can you tell a little bit about her hypervisibility and what it meant in terms of erasure? Her films made millions, but she never was allowed to cross over to mainstream cinema. What does her story tell us about the limits of mobility in the film industry?
Great question, Cher. So, in my 2019 article, which came out in Feminist Media, that's where, I was thinking about precarious stardom, which also appears in the book. Very fact that Shakila was a star, but she was not a star in the currency of the term we use in mainstream cinema. She was a star whose stardom was precariously placed on multiple counts, that she can only be a star in soft porn and she can never be even a second tier star in mainstream cinema, because by the very fact that she became like this hyper visible figure and a mascot for soft porn meant that she's not permitted or allowed to cross over to other things, despite the fact that she acted in cameo roles with many mainstream actors. Her presence there was always as a soft porn star Shakila coming in, not as an actress Shakila coming in. So the entry exit kind of barriers are interesting. So Shakila's films, like when Shakila's first film was Kinnara Tumbigal, which was made by a director called R.J. Prasad. So in my interview with R.J. Prasad, it's very interesting. He's a filmmaker who wanted to make an art film, and the film was actually thought through very interestingly in terms of scripting and other things. And there is this angle of intergenerational love in the film, which automatically put the film as a soft porn, even though the film did not have too much of sexual 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 simulation per se. The promotion strategies used by the distributors create a certain aura of it being like a sex film, because again many of these film had this idea of a elderly woman who is actually initiating the younger men into the intricacies of lovemaking. So Shakila's figure was like that. So that particular idea of Shakila, a heavy-bodied, buxom figure, also captured the imagination of Madhaka Rani as someone who is not a woman whom you will marry, but who is the other woman, the mistress figure, whom you can fantasize about, who will not demand a marriage or anything more than what you provide. So it's interesting that that kind of circuit of desire and fantasy basically etched onto the body of Shakila. And the films became so successful, so much so that the softporn films in general, at one point of time came to be called Shakila films. So in my research, I also went to a lot of softporn theaters showing these films. So, in 2010, when I started the project, I was actually, going to a bunch of theaters in Kerala to get a sense of what does it look like to watch these films and how are these films being projected. And the projectionist has a crucial role to play in softporn films, because always keep in mind softporn films is the last fag end of celluloid era, right? So the celluloid era is nostalgically associated with soft porn in the Malayali imagination, because that's the time where the transition took place. So there are what is called tunda, or sexually explicit pieces or cut pieces, which are added into the film reel during the exhibition by the projectionist. So I was curious to know about it, and I always wanted to know about what were the projectionists thinking, at what part of the film that they wanted to insert this clip, etc. So I interviewed a lot of projectionists also, who had like fantastic stories to share. And it's not like they will insert it when and where it pleases. They had a logic as well in terms of what will fit in. And what they had in mind is that they wanted to give the surprise to the audience. They want the audience to know that there is someone behind the screen who is thinking through the idea of cinematic pleasure, the unanticipated cut piece, disrupting your pleasure of watching the film. But again, like, that pleasure is what you're looking for.
Yeah.
So I found it fascinating, because these men are really thought through it. I'm talking about men who are in their 60s, who are working as projectionists, and for them also talking about this was really exciting, because I don't think anybody actually thought any person would come there to talk to them. And it was a very promising experience for me to know that there is a project out there which I'm interested to unpack. So going back to Shakila's films were very popular. And Shakila was not the only soft porn actress. There were a bunch of other actresses. And another thing to keep in mind about soft porn, especially Malayalam soft porn, is that they never allowed a native indigenous actress to perform these roles. Soft porn
Interesting.
actresses were all from outside Kerala. They were from neighboring states like Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Telugu, even Maharashtra and Punjab, right? So for
Why
them,
was that?
it was, I think, like when I spoke to a bunch of filmmakers, and A.T. Joy being and U.C. Roshan, they were saying that, it's always better not to shoot the films, if possible, in Kerala, and not to use film labor, especially women's labor. The women has to be from outside so that we can protect the industry. If at all, the kind of like attacks that possibly would have women's group, or for that matter, morally conservative groups would have against us, we could still say that, this is a labor force which is mixed. This is not only a Malayali labor force. And also, that I think there is a cultural purity argument to it. They're not agreeing that they thought through it, but it's also about the fact that the native women from Kerala were not recruited directly, also would basically give them a free pass. That, they're not like, and one thing I remember one of the producers telling me that if at all like people moonlight as sex workers, they do other odd jobs, and they do not want these women to be seen as sex workers, because it decredits and delegitimizes the kind of labor that goes into the making of the film. So cultural purity argument on the one hand, and labor procurement on the other. And that's why, Madhaka Rani figures were always seen as coming from outside. Vijay also, like the earlier actress I mentioned, she was born and brought up in Chennai, even though she's a Malayali. So it's interesting that that argument has always been there. So Shakila, after a point decided to, like, charge per day instead of for per project. So at one point of time, she charged around 1 lakh rupees per day. And that's when filmmakers realized that they can shoot for multiple films on one day. which Shakila was not aware of. And many film industry insiders still think that that basically was the death knell of the industry.
Yeah.
Like multiple films being made simultaneously, similar plots, and the recycling of material. So that was the kind of transition. And Shakila like also had her own kind of preferences in terms of what role she would be doing. And she never did topless roles. There were also a body double that she had, who wrote, like in my book, I refers to that, who basically wrote a memoir about her experience of being a body double of Shakila. So even to think that a soft porn actress would have a body double in an industry was interesting, right? So
You also argue that Shakila's presence in Malayalam film is sort of a challenge to both industrial and social hierarchies, right? Could you expand on that further as well?
yeah. So on two things. One is that, like soft porn films primarily had its narrative centered around a kind of a female lead who had her desires, and this whole story was about her desires, her aspirations, and struggle she goes through. So the male actors did not have much role to play. So much so that they all felt humiliated being part of this film. So some of the male actors who acted in soft porn were like, oh God, that was not okay, where we did not have anything in control, right? Like the whole narrative was about the woman and not about us.
Yeah.
And even in film reports about soft porn, you will see this idea of emasculinating kind of tendency of soft porn, where the masculinity of the actor is being taken away, where the female lead is the main person around whom the narrative centers, around whom the production decision of the film centers around. So that also unsettled the way we think about film production in mainstream cinema, because in mainstream cinema it's a heavily actor centric production pattern. You
Many
basically
of many of your interviewees spoke about how their labor in the soft porn films was sort of was hidden.
yeah.
You know, technicians, directors would use pseudonyms. What does that tell us about the status of the industry? And I think it also relates to the question of alternative labor networks, right?
Right. So soft porn, the peak of soft porn came at a time when Malayalam film industry was facing significant financial crisis. All the films by main film stars were failing in the box office, and the film exhibitors and distributors needed some survival mechanism. Soft porn films were low budget films, and that became like a kind of a make do arrangement that allowed the film industry to recoup that kind of struggling phase. And many exhibitors whom I spoke with said that Shakira was the savior. She was the savior who basically helped us stay afloat. And
Yeah.
software also gave a possibility for technicians from mainstream industry to basically, move to soft porn, use fictitious name, be part of the filmmaking, and move back. And that was the main concern I had when I was trying to track down people. The people whose name appear in the credits sometimes don't exist. And you're trying to triangulate the data from multiple sources, and you're like, who are these people? Are these people real? And that's when I decided that I will work with a production manager. This production manager is like the intermediary. He will know the pre-production process, he will know the production, he will know the post-production, because he's the one handing over the print to the lab. So
Yeah.
I thought that will be the person, and I was absolutely right. I think that was the person who basically helped me unpack the fictitious terminologies around it. And there were many like prominent directors who were part of soft porn, but who do not talk about it. And some of them made films in their own names, but did not consider them to have dabbled in soft porn. But there is also this kind of a creative license that is given, right? Like you made good films, but this was like one of those films that you made because things were
Yeah.
bad. But that also means that the soft porn filmmakers who made these films, who were basically coming from below the line labor force, some of them were production assistants, some of them were makeup artists. So when they started to think about making the films, the main kind of drive for them was to have creative decision making. They're like, we know what films will sell, because they were like NRI films. I will get to that in a second, which were flooding the market, and these films were highly successful, and exhibitors were vouching for the fact that you make films with the same template that will succeed.
Yeah.
It became an indigenous way of using the exploitation film paradigm to make films that will appeal to the local audience, something the local audience are already familiar culturally, like through Kambipadam and erotic fiction, so that they don't have to think about it as import from outside. So for many of my respondents, like soft porn was like the death knell of their career. You enter soft porn to the disappointment of your family members and everyone around you. They were taking a huge risk. And, so as a female ethnographer in the field, and I was in the field for longer, like people would invite me to their family because sometimes their wives will be concerned about why you're hanging around with a woman all the time. And they wanted me to talk about my work as a broader interest in film production, but not in
Yeah.
software. So they were like, no one wants to be reminded of that phase where everyone was disappointed that this is what has happened to you. So there is this idea of a corruption, or the impure element unsettling our family and our kind of pride as workers, that was there on one side of the journey. So for many filmmakers, I think talking about soft porn after like 15 years since decline, I think that time gave a little bit of time to process what happened. And some of them even said that we were way ahead of our time. And right now you have like the idea of phone sex and this online erotic platforms and creator culture doing exactly what we were trying to do years before.
Yeah. So I just wanted to add, I guess like it relates to this other question I had. Could the industry be seen as a form of economic resistance as well?
I think it could be seen as a resistance against the hierarchy that structured film industry, because there is a kind of a premium placed on idea of waiting, that you wait for the right time, you wait, and only waiting will fetch you returns. So anyone whom I spoke with said that we are waiting, we have to be resilient. So the idea of resilience is created as kind of a kind of what you should ideally follow if you want to succeed. So there is a success mantra embedded in film industry. Most of the films fail, very few succeed. So I was interested in the idea of success and failure, economically speaking, like economic success in terms of box office. And like you said earlier, Shakila did not get anything at the end of the day, right? She became like the mascot of soft porn films, but financially speaking, it didn't give her much, because the informal way in which film production in general functions doesn't give that kind of negotiation power for actors, or film personnel in general. But in this case, I think that soft porn industry, its rise and fall, is important in the history of Malayalam cinema on two counts. One is that was the one time when people are talking about different scales of hierarchy. Why can't a makeup man make a film? Are we like stuck here forever?
Yeah. Yeah.
And like, or an assistant director who had made like 25 films, and he's in his 50s and he's still assistant. So I think that idea of wanting to cut the line, not in terms of like cutting the line by taking someone's position, but they wanted to know that there is an alternative arena possible, and the alternative arena was money and capital. Where do you come up with the money? And these people were enterprising, sure, we should agree, because they basically contacted financiers based in Gulf,
Mhm.
Malayalis who have gone to Gulf, and they wanted to see a film with this, like their name in it, and want to know the production around it. So many of these films were funded by Gulf producers, who sometimes did not use their name. They used the name of their managers or made up names. And many of these banners that produce the films did not last for too long. They made one or two films and then disappeared.
Yeah.
But I think that is the argument that is used against soft porn, that soft porn was not interested in labor. They just came, they were interested in money. But I would say that we needed to shift the narrative a little bit, because there is something more to it, why people would take so much of a risk to
Thanks.
compromise some stories. Yeah, so it is also, so there is an economic argument to be made about soft porn. Soft porn came as a make do arrangement, but soft porn was also trying to work with new arrangements in the exhibition and distribution. I'll end with that. Exhibition and distribution network was where soft porn filmmakers were trying to understand what really would work by helping the exhibitor and distributor reduce the risk. So any
Mhm.
mainstream film which goes to an exhibition or a distribution circuit, they have to pay huge advances in order to procure the material. In the case of soft porn films, there was a different profit sharing arrangement between the distributor and the exhibitor. It's a 50-50 thing. So no one is losing much. If the film is going to succeed, they will get it. If it is going to lose, the losses will be kind of equally tallied in their accounts. So I think that alternative possibility of what could happen, where you are thinking of different stakeholders who are all like pushing against their boundaries of what they would have ideally do in a normal scenario, was something I think was very much evident in soft porn's rise and decline.
I want to get into censorship for a bit. Censorship in India and Pakistan and South Asia often amplifies desire rather than suppressing it. Why do you think censorship and sexual curiosity are so deeply intertwined?
I think censorship of media content has been like one thing which is again a lineage of the colonial baggage.
Mhm.
So the idea of obscenity narratives, or the kind of legal regulations around obscenity, has been the blueprint in India and Pakistan, and like broader Indian subcontinent, because British colonial intervention was like crucial in laying out what is appropriate, what is not, and how to tide the wave of spread of this illicit representations. So right from the beginning, obscenity has been the go-to kind of framework for understanding a Central Board of Film certification and their take on what representations matter and what are the representations that people will not want to see. So they imagine this kind of audience who would be upset by seeing sexuality, and sexuality by default alongside violence became those things that should be avoided in a film. If it is shown in an excess, that will count as A films, and even for adult films, there were parts that were kind of muted and removed. And I went through a lot of censor board reports, and
Yeah.
it's interesting that their argument has been that you have to change the conclusion of a film because the film is giving too much of leeway for this woman to do things, and which many softporn filmmakers ended up doing as well. So that is why I'm saying that softporn films, when they are exhibited in the film hall, the audience are not viewing just like a mainstream cinema. They know that there are a lot of mediations that are at place from the level of production till exhibition. And the ending, what you see is not the real ending. The ending could be a different ending. So you're also speculating and trying to make those connections. One of the filmmakers told me that, they asked us to change the ending and we had to kill the heroine. And I was like,
Yeah.
you killed the heroine? It's like, yeah, that was the only way possible. But I'm sure that everyone knows that she's not supposed to die because that's not what we were trying to say. And I was like, wow, that's like a good way of expecting that the audience get a drift of it. So
We've seen moral panics around interfaith pornography, especially like Muslim men with Hindu women videos or anything else, which sort of disrupt nationalist purity narratives, right? Why do you think these categories provoke such intense censorship and violence?
yeah, the idea of censorship is kind of very interesting because censorship is also about creating a very volatile public who's going to respond immediately by saying that we are upset by it, we are unsettled by it. Monica Mehta, who has a fantastic book on censorship in Bombay cinema, she writes about it, and there is a piece in Journal of Cinema and Media Studies where Monica and me are in conversation talking about what has changed. Her book came out in 2011,
Oh,
mine in
wow.
2024. So 10 years gap, and we are both looking at censorship in a very different kind of way and what connects these conversations. So there's an important point that we make there in terms of, the idea of publics. Publics are important for censorship because censorship cannot be coming out of vacuum. It is directed at someone. It is also leveraging its power from that same media publics,
Yeah.
saying that we have received a complaint that there is unauthorized content that is added onto this film and we want it to be removed because people are upset. So this volatility is important. And you'll also remember that censorship also creates this idea of a low class audience who could be influenced by what they see on screen and enact it, whether it's violence or sex. So there is also a kind of a classist discourse that you will see in a lot of these censorship documents on in terms of like, why do we need censorship, why why do you have to ask the director to submit the whole script, which has to be seen side by side with watching the film, so that the audio and video kind of correlation could be made. So it's interesting to keep in mind that anything that doesn't fit into this idea of a nation state's understanding of what it is to protect and preserve a certain normative kind of purity, whether it's in the relationship, everything is upsetting factor which can trigger a volatile public. So I think that's where the thing is, because all the publics are seen as affect. There is an affect-driven kind of sentiment that
Yeah.
it's not normal, it's abnormal, and it needs to be contained and regulated. So
Yeah.
that's where the logic is. So right now we have an advisory from the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, which is directed to all online curated platforms, saying that we have received information that there are sexuality and obscene representations that you have. So you'll have to align with the media ethics rule of 2021, and age appropriate content has to be shown. So these advisories are constant reminders that the surveillance mechanism is in place. We are constantly monitoring. There are people who can report on you, and I think that's how surveillance societies function, and censorship is
Yeah.
certainly one part of it.
Yeah, I wonder, moral policing often comes with state surveillance, and we're seeing increasing number of digital crackdowns on pornography in South Asia. Do you think censorship is just about sexuality, or is it about controlling broader dissent?
I think, censorship is about containing this, the things which are seen as excess, abnormal, and anything that goes against the status quo. So, of course,
Yeah.
this is part of it. And, it's not just about sexuality. We have seen like a certain version of, what counts as historical claims. And a lot of films like Padmavat, a bunch of films in the Indian cinema in the recent past, which had to be either changed. And Annapurani, there is a film that had to be withdrawn from Amazon Prime or Netflix, one of those platforms, because it upset certain groups, and they had lead actress had to offer a public apology. So it's interesting that there is certain expectations around what count as risk-free media. And all the corporate platforms, whether it's Netflix or Amazon Prime or Z5 Global, they all have their executives, like global executives based in LA or different parts, who are going to look very closely and scrutinize material. And nobody wants to enter into this one-to-one thing with national governments, because their own very presence in these countries are also facilitated by the goodwill of the government. So it's interesting that they're not going to push back against being asked to remove a content because it's creating moral panic. They're going to abide by it because they wanted to stay, and they're thinking of a long game as opposed to being tied to the kind of values that they want to promote. So with the platform era, things are changing, and I think censorship is going to become much more stringent in the years to come, because think about it, with every technological transition, there is this moral panic. Cable television, video, piracy. Like video was like seen as a hub of piracy. And how video parlors are creating this kind of anxiety around what gets shown in the small parlors. Same with cable television. When cable television came, also there was this anxiety around what will happen to the films now that films are going to be shown on cable television, and they are engaging in this illicit practice of showcasing new films in slots where the films are still new and are in circulation. The platform, the streaming market, is a prime spot where censorship will be imposed. And I think it's like right now it's like a testing space where governments are trying to see how can you navigate this, because it's not just about a national market. These are global corporate companies. So there is a push and pull relationship you will see, and many of these advisories are an indication that regulation is an ongoing conversation.
This is really interesting. So, despite all the stigma and censorship, alternative spaces for sexuality and pornography are also emerging. Can we think of soft porn as a space of resistance, even when it operates within capitalist and patriarchal constraints?
One thing is that the OTT platforms that are basically right now the space where many of these films are being made as series. One doesn't know about the labor practices there, right? So like we see a lot of complaints and like a lot of media sensationalism around the fact that women are being tricked into it, they are being exploited. That's a narrative that is emerging. But at the same time, there is a lot of circulation and distribution of these content, and there's a huge subscription network that they're relying on, both in South Asia and also the South Asian diaspora abroad. So that's where the difference is from soft porn. Soft porn, like, must have gone maximum to the Middle Eastern Gulf and
Yeah.
not the global north.
Yeah.
Like we have, like Anirban Baishya, a colleague of mine and me, we have written a piece on one of the Canadian cammers who is actually, looking at this auntie figure and taking kind of South Asian references in order to carve out kind of an audience that she's looking for. And she's using her own ethnicity as a South Asian woman to do that. And that's in the Canadian context. So it's interesting that these things are coexisting. The idea of camming is coexisting alongside this hub of films that are being made, and and all of these are curated content, right? Like any other streaming platform, algorithmic choices are also like kind of conditioning what you like, what you want to see, and so that time shifting option is also creating new patterns of viewing on multiple devices, or moving from one device and catching up on another device. So, this kind of erotic content is right now consumed like a television show, like a film, not just as porn. Like there was a point of time in the 90s, I don't know whether you would remember, but all the internet cafes in
Yeah.
India, they were like in various parts of South Asia, I'm sure,
Yeah.
had this kind of restriction that If you're going inside, you will have to, be in a space which is public enough, quasi-public, so that you're not engaging in intimacy, or
Yeah.
more than two people cannot go into a booth alone. So it's
Mhm.
interesting that there are concerns about public morality and
Yeah.
technological transition that are integrally connected, and doesn't change when things move to streaming, when it's not just about men attending a soft porn exhibition in a B circuit cinema hall, where it's an all male audience and there is a certain homosociality that comes with it, right?
Yeah.
Right now it's about devices, and you have that individual private space that you're creating, and moving between technologies. And I also want to say that Showgirls of Pakistan, which is like a documentary about Mujra done performers, was
Yeah.
yeah, I would like to hear what you think about it, because I thought that was very
I
interesting.
I have so much to say, but I'm still learning how to interview in a way where I don't get the interview off track. But
Yeah, yeah,
just having researched regional films and the role of masculinity and like in Punjabi cinema and other things, I do see a lot of parallels. But to give a cohesive sort of, I haven't had a chance to watch that documentary, but
mm-hmm.
yeah, I do see a lot of parallels in my mind, but I haven't been able to
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
articulate it in a way where I can contribute to the discussion right away.
Because I thought that the Mujra and the Lotte Hawk has written about Bangladeshi cut pieces. So she.
So when I was a film reporter, our environmental department used to do the censorship. So they
Mm,
would go into these sort of stage shows. And in my interviews with a lot of the stage dancers and those things, uh, you know, a lot of them felt this sort of feeling of, guilt,
mm,
towards their craft. So a lot of them, used to do like dars in the middle of their performances, read
mm,
the Quran, pray during their performances so that, they could feel that, they weren't doing something so taboo
mm.
in that context. But there's so many elements to it. Obviously the role of censorship has a huge role in the film industry there, and surveillance as well. So yeah.
I think there is something about the circulation of soft porn, mujra, and this Bangladeshi cut pieces, creating a different sensorium in terms of what media is. Because when I went to some of the markets in Karama, there were like a lot of these like cassettes which were like stacked together, in
Uh-huh.
terms of like, and like people were like, these are all like from South Asia, these are all from like India, Pakistan. So there is an imagination created by seeing all of them in one place, one space. And even though they might be like circulating or have very different mode of production or cultural perception around performance, there is
Yeah.
something about it not being the mainstream, but
Yeah.
creating kind of a quasi, public and audience where, they all know that these are parts of tabooed fantasies, but at the same time, they are like in currency. People are looking
Yeah.
for it.
Yeah. I guess like my other question is, South Asian feminist movements many of them have taken an anti-porn stance. Do you think there's a space for feminist or radical porn that challenges these dominant narratives?
Actually, there is a lot of scholarship around feminist porn studies. So there is a book called Feminist Porn Book. A lot of scholars like Constance Penley and Myrtle Miller Young, Lynn Kamala, Jennifer Nash. A lot of these scholars are writing about a feminist intervention into understanding the kind of messiness around pornography, because we need to move around from anti censorship, pro censorship kind of, because
Uh-huh.
that doesn't take you anywhere. And you need to understand that what we are looking for is like a different way of knowledge production, where we're interested in inclusive practices, where we're talking to different stakeholders involved in it. My project would have been very different if I was just talking only to the men involved and not the women, right? Similarly, the idea of inclusivity also means that you are taking a step back from what censorship is, as opposed to what censorship does, in changing the terms and conditions under which we speak about adult media. So
Uh-huh.
many of these scholars have worked on, like, so the Middle Miller Young's work is about African American women who are
Uh-huh.
working in pornography, where she talks about the pushback she felt from the community, saying that why are you interested in looking at porn, because black bodies are always sexualized, and you're
Uh-huh.
adding on to it. And so she's talking about the kind of concerns that she wanted to put forth, saying that respectability is one thing, but we also need to think about the agency of these women. How are they thinking about this as labor? And many of these women in Meryl Miller Young's interview say that they're doing it because they basically wanted to get a feel of what it looks like. And sometimes, like for them, the idea of freelancing is much more kind of economically viable rather than be tied to a 9 to 5 job. So, interesting aspect. Heather Berg has a book on porn and work, looking at porn workers and sex workers and the understanding of a Marxist understanding of class and labor practices that inform it. So there is a lot of scholarship in the Western context that look at pornography. So when I started my work, there weren't much scholarship in the Indian context. So Shohini Ghosh has written on pornography, and Chadu Gupta has written extensively on porn, Anjali Arundekar. So I did have like this signaling work, but in terms of media porn intersection, there has not been much work. So like when I started my work, like I started my PhD in JNU, then I moved to USC for my PhD, and that was a time when I got in touch with this other scholars in Europe and in US working on adult media. So my project changed drastically when I could embrace the fact that media can be studied on its own terms rather than being subscribed into women's studies or gender studies or sexuality studies. I would say that that was like a eye-opening moment for me because sometimes there are clashes between different interpretations of what counts as women's studies or gender studies. I still remember like having a conversation with a seasoned feminist scholar.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting because I think like we see a tension in the global pornography industry between like erotic labor as a site of empowerment and as a site of exploitation. I wonder, in terms of South Asian conversations on sexuality and pornography, how do they differ from Western sort of feminist and like intellectual debates on this subject?
Yeah, so one thing is that, feminism is not just one thing. Even among the South Asian feminist scholars and feminist interventions, there are different ways in which people are looking at agency, what counts as women's labor, respectability. When do you start to speak about sexuality? When, there are deeply hierarchical, patriarchal logic that structure the day-to-day reality of women in South Asia. So I think it depends on what your starting point is going to be, because a lot of scholarship on pornography in the initial days in 1980s. So Brinda Bose also has a book on censorship, where the interesting set of material that came out in the early 2000s, and those materials are like media kind of interventions are all tapped into, which became very important when I started to build on that. So it's important to keep in mind that sometimes feminist interventions are also responding to a particular moment. Let's say the moment of 1990s or the moment of Nirbhaya case. So that particular moment will be resonating with the energy and charge where you are trying to respond to feminist movement. Actually, it depends on what moment each of these feminist movements are responding to. Because like say that, feminist grassroots level movements of the 1980s would be very different from the 90s moment or, Nirbhaya incident. So it's important to keep in mind that it's a conversation. There are different ideologies, different kind of political investment each of these strands of feminisms have. And I think the kind of productive tension that they have is something that you will see in soft porn and the responses to it. There were a lot of women's groups who protested against soft porn, saying that soft porn is the indecent representation of women. They are exploiting actresses and they have like a lot of problematic and questionable casting practices, etc. And the support for soft porn to be looked at in a nuanced way by understanding that soft porn women are not always being tricked into it. It comes much later, and that comes with the genre of autobiographical accounts. So we have this
Oh, okay.
autobiography by Nalini Jamila, which Jamila writes about. And, it's interesting that what does it mean for a sex worker to write her own experiences itself has been a contested debate in Kerala. It's literally, is it literature? Is it memoir? Is it like autobiographical confessions? So I think that was a key moment. And J. Devika has a fantastic introduction to the English translation of the book. She lays out those complications really, really well. Shakila also had a memoir. It was like part of, like a kind of a compilation. Somebody has listened to her story and then compiled it. And that became the premise for a biopic on her called Shakira, Not a Porn Star, which I don't think had served much in terms of demystifying her life. But I think the autobiographical account and the, accompanying media visibility where Shakila started to talk about her experiences did a lot in terms of understanding who Shakila is as opposed to just the icon that you see in the film. And Shakila right now has like a very wide network. And I think what is interesting for us to hold on to while you read the book and while you hear about more conversation about soft porn is the fact that Shakira also appeared in a promo sketch for the Amazon series Sex Education. So Sex Education, yeah.
Yeah. No, I have about four more questions left
Okay.
because this is such an exciting conversation. I've been thinking a lot about who actually controls like visibility in South Asian pornography and how the global porn platforms shape what kinds of bodies are considered desirable in a sense. And I'll just latch on the second question from this section, which is there's a growing industry of South Asian adult content creators, some using platforms like OnlyFans for economic survival, and others trying to reclaim sexual agency. Do you see this as a shift, of sorts?
Yes, I certainly see this as a shift because online platforms like OnlyFans had allowed a space for creators like erotic performers to basically think about what is economical for them, what is comfortable for them. So in the book, I actually end with one of the creators who's also like trying to talk about the kind of pushback she has faced. She's based in the US, and she's also like trying to say what does it mean for a creator who's a Malayali woman to be doing this. On the one hand, it's also like performing certain tropes of soft porn, but at the same time these platforms also put you in continuation with this expectation of that there is a availability of it being something more than just performance. So I think she talks about it like very interestingly, and there are a lot of South Asian creators who are in OnlyFans, and there is a very curated way in which these South Asian ethnicity is kind of like marketed in global platforms like Pornhub. So if you like look at Pornhub, you will see there are a lot of clips from soft porn films
Yeah.
that appear there, and they're all part of like broader Indian porn, or nobody calls it Malayalam porn anymore. Now it all becomes part of either auntie porn, which is again like these tropes that were used in soft porn. So I think it's kind of packaged for a
Yeah.
kind of a global platform which is looking for metadata and keyword and algorithm in order to curate experiences and search, like the search engines, what they're looking for. Pornhub has this research thing called Pornhub Insights, and I usually kind of look at it just to get a sense of what has changed, and the keyword pattern has changed over a period of time in terms of what keywords have been used, because in this era of AI, it's also about like identifying those keywords and trying to streamline it so that you are able to basically tap into the kind of desires and wish list people are looking for. And many of these content that appears in these platforms are not really original content. They are derivative content from soft porn films or other films which are taken out of their context, but again, like repackaged it using different metadata. So that is something to keep in mind while we are looking at
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, I wonder. I think it was like Jose Esteban Munoz
Yeah.
who talks about queer utopia, a way of imagining, pleasure beyond capitalist and caste structures, maybe in a sense. I wonder if like pornography in certain spaces can, function as a site of possibility as well, beyond just like consumptive sort of curated sort of pieces of media content or something like that.
Always this possibility of a different future. I think when I
Yeah.
started with this project, I was like, what is the main takeaway of us looking at a tabooed and marginalized film industry? For me, it is just about female sexual pleasure. We never talk about that in the Indian context. None of the films really kind of refer to it because it's again seen as something that will like, be in the radar of censorship guidelines and regulations. But what does it mean for people to live their life with dignity, the kind of choices they have taken and wanted to put to practice? And I think that option has to be there. That should not be taken away from them. One thing is that, there are a lot of regulatory and, social kind of constraints that already condition certain expectations from women in societies. And
Yeah.
it's important for us to treat people who do erotic work or people who do sex work, who consider sex as labor, as equal partners as much as we would support, actresses in general. And I think that's where I consider this to be like part of the broader labor concerns, because in the gig economy era, like people who do OnlyFans work for like 5 hours a day might feel that to be like a better investment of their time than working for 9 to 5, like many of as young respondents said. So the changed era of like what does it mean in terms of work satisfaction, or what you consider as something that is worth exploring for your desire and dignity. I think that is where the openness has to be there. I don't believe in closing down conversations. I believe in opening out conversations, where conversations around sexual desire, conversations about what does it mean to feel that you belong. For a
Yeah.
woman, seeing a lesbian couple kissing might just be like one thing that you probably might not see in a lot of mainstream representations. If that is what can connect them about who they are, what they feel, and give them happiness, then let it be so. We don't have to completely shut it down because it doesn't fit into the hetero normative matrix of idealized representation.
Yeah, that's an important thing for readers and viewers of this channel to take away. Uh, and what's next for you? Where do you see your research going from here? Are you working on any interesting projects, and any advice to young researchers out there?
So the second book project is very different from the rated A sexuality thing. I'm working on colonial plantations in Southeast Asia and looking at the labor migration between South Asia and Southeast Asia, the indentured labor and plantation imagination, and how does it kind of situate the Malaysian Indian identity. So it's like a archival project, but also like taps into the Malaysian Indian community, their media making practices, and what does it feel for them to hold on to their Indian roots while they are, being part of this assemblage of nostalgic experiences around plantations. With young scholars, I actually get a lot of, emails from people asking about like, would you advise us doing a work on sexuality or porn under the kind of political climates that we are in? Because that's the question I normally get from grad students who want to apply to our program at Madison. And I think if
Yeah.
it really, if this is a project you think you want to do, you should certainly go ahead and do it. Always think about like, PhD is like a long time commitment. That what we think as trending, let's say in 2025, might not be as exciting for you 5 years later. So it's always like 5 years later, will you still feel as excited with this project as you are now? That is the kind of litmus test for me. And that excitement is what actually makes people hold on to it and understand new ways of producing knowledge. I think how knowledge is produced, how do you kind of like write histories of precariously placed communities who are marginalized, whose histories have always been written using sensational narratives. I think there is a lot of ethical investment in writing those stories, and it's not doesn't emerge in like 1 or 2 years. Sometimes it means waiting for like 10 years. But when you
Yeah.
feel that's what the community wants and that's what connects you, I think that's the pleasure that comes out of research. So
I want to thank you, Darshana, for taking out time. I know you have to get to class and educate the next generation of scholars out there. Thank you for this very important discussion around censorship, caste, film labor, and the politics of sexuality in South Asia. Your work is really amazing. And to the viewers out there, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so you can support the work of this network.
thank you, Share.